Well, first of all, thank you so much to Nobu-san, my friend, to ERIA, Watanabe-san as well for organizing this, members of the Indonesian government, friends, fellow panelists as well. It's a real honor to be here and reflect with you all on the Aceh peace process, which is ongoing, right? It's a 20-year process still, and you know, it's something that I think we all have to remember. Peace is something that has to be continued to nurture, right? And so I'm really happy to see that there is this opportunity to reflect on the 20 years since the MOU. As the MC just mentioned, I'm at Georgetown SFS Asia Pacific. This is our new campus for Georgetown in Jakarta for the Asia Pacific. But before that, I was actually in Georgetown's main campus in Washington, D.C. And I actually spent a year and a half from 2006 to 2007 living in Aceh while I was working at the World Bank, focused on what the former combatants were doing. So I spent a lot of time interviewing former combatants, I think over 200 from the period from 2006 until 2017. I also fielded a survey interviewing about 1,000 former combatants and about 4,000 civilians, and then moved over to the southern Philippines, where I was trying to understand what happened with the Moro National Liberation Front and the Moro Islamic Liberation Front as a comparison to Aceh. And really, Aceh was an exemplar of what a successful peace agreement could be. It sort of demonstrated what was actually possible, right? Whereas the Moro movements, for a long time, they would have these peace agreements, and then they would fall apart, and you would have these splintering groups that would come off of the mother group. And so that was the big puzzle for me, is for this book. It's taken me 20 years, it's still in progress. I wanted to make sure, I like to say that the Aceh process is still successful, but more realistically, it's because of other distractions I've had in my career. So I'll be speaking from the perspective of an observer of the Aceh peace process in comparison a little bit with the Mindanao peace processes. One of the sort of stylized facts that I'd like to begin with, though, is the fact that if you look at the civil wars that are going on in the world today, about 90% are actually recurrences where they've already had peace agreements, and yet they fell apart. And this is actually a very common occurrence. And yet, if we look at the case of Aceh, it's one that had some very successful outcomes. The first is that there wasn't really significant violence between the state and former combatants after the signing of the MOU. Second, it was a context in which there was a series of 4 democratic elections. Now, there were certain bouts of violence in 2012, in the 2012 election, but since then there has been no sort of serious outbreaks of violence during these electoral periods, and so it is something that is quite remarkable, and I think it's important to try to understand how did Aceh beat these odds, right? So the fact that 90% of conflicts right now are actually recurrences. And I actually think that we can make some comparisons not only with the southern Philippines, but also if we look at southern Thailand and other places, and maybe there are some lessons that can be had that can be brought over. Now, every conflict, of course, is different. So turning to the Aceh case, the prevailing story of how Aceh succeeded, everyone will start with the tsunami. It was the tsunami. If you didn't have the tsunami, it wouldn't have worked. Well, I'm not 100% sold on that, because I think at the time when the Boxing Day tsunami happened in 2004, there was a lot of exhaustion on both sides, actually, right? But certainly the tsunami did create a face-saving opportunity to come back to the table. The second part of this sort of, shall we say, conventional wisdom is that aid money started flowing in and incentivized the government and the insurgents to put down their arms and work towards peace. A third element of this story is that international monitoring ensured that both sides followed through on their commitments. And then fourth, there was this notion that disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration was able to succeed in ensuring that ex-combatants would never take up arms again. Now, I do think there is some truth to different elements of this, but I think this story overlooks probably the most important aspect of what sustained the peace. This story that I've told you is one that you hear when you're in New York or in Washington. You hear or you read in journals that sort of are written from the outside. But I think it overemphasizes the role of outsiders and undersells the importance of the important negotiations that were being had on the ground in Aceh and in Indonesia. In other words, what I'd like to do here is focus more on the internal politics. Now, the problem with this prevailing story is that the tsunami, of course, did create a face-saving condition for negotiations be taken up again. So I don't want to say that that didn't have any effect. It certainly did. As I mentioned, the international literature tends to attribute peace to external actors. I think it's a little bit self-serving, right? To say, well, it was because we came in and helped you guys out. And certainly the Aceh Monitoring Mission was extremely important, especially in the early period. If you don't have that, then there's no trust, and you can't build up trust and reputation for this to actually, that both sides will be sort of carrying out their commitments. So you have to have that initial period. But the problem is, everyone knows that the external monitors will be leaving at some point, right? So then what is it that's going to sustain the peace afterwards, right? And I think that's where we really have to look at the internal politics on the ground to figure that out. Now, another element of this story is that tsunami aid through the BRR, through international institutions, did come in and provide an initial cushion for ex-combatants to come through, the BRA as well, so that they can transition from war, because these folks were in the jungles, they had their guns, they didn't have much when they came back to their villages, right? And so they needed something to get by initially with. And certainly that is important. But the problem with saying, well, that's, a very important part of the story and that's it, is that eventually the cash runs out, right? And it ran out pretty quickly. So when I was there in 2006, and I was going to the different villages in Aceh Selatan, South Aceh, Bener Meriah in the Central Highlands, Biren, I started out in the villages. And you had these combatants who were just coming back. And many of them were trying to just get food to mouth, really. They had no assets. They didn't have jobs. Some of them, the only thing that they knew as adults was how to fight, right? So they needed to have some cash already from the beginning. And so having that initial infusion of cash was really important. But one of the things, so I'm a political economist, and one of the most important lessons from microeconomics that I learned was one-time transfers of cash do not change behaviors. You have to have a stream of revenues that incentivize behavior, right? In other words, when we sort of take that lesson into the peace-building literature, you have to think of it as one-time transfers to ex-combatants. They'll take it, and then they can do whatever else they want to do with it. But if you use it to incentivize people to keep the peace, that is where you can have a more sustained solution. And so this is where I do have a little bit, not a little bit, one of my agendas with this book has always been to sort of question the efficacy of the disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration package that has become standard operating procedure in various post-conflict contexts. Now, what is the solution that should work if DDR is not effective? Well, let me first start with disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. This is something that, of course, really arose in the 1990s when you would go to UN brokered peace processes, a lot in Africa, for example. And you would start with the idea of that you have to start to disarm immediately, right? So the former combatants, they have to disarm. Why? Well, because if war is where you have armed, mobilized groups that are not integrated with civilians, then peace is where you have disarmament, demobilization of these groups, and reintegration of combatants into civilian life. Makes total sense. The problem is you cannot just do this in one go. You can't just take away their guns. You cannot just demobilize them. And reintegration is harder than just giving them a package of money and training them on how to fix motorbikes, and then expect them to run a business fixing motorbikes. And that's really a package that many of these policies actually implemented. It looks good for the international donors. They can say, we invest in this, we trained them, hey, we cleared our books, we're out. Everything is up to you after that, right? That's not really how it works, right? And so the success that Aceh had, I don't want to attribute that to DDR because I don't think that's what happened. In fact, if you look at the statistical evidence of DDR across different countries around the world, there's actually no evidence that DDR is correlated in any way with better peace outcomes. And in Aceh, there are a few things that make me doubt the efficacy of DDR. The peace agreement meant that there were 700 guns that were surrendered by GAM. There were more than 700 GAM fighters. There were 15,000 or plus or minus, okay, something in that range. So where are the other guns, right? So they didn't disarm. They were out there, okay? Second, the reintegration programs that I mentioned, right, where they would give them these packages, they would train them. Many times they were quite small, and most of the time, when I would look at some of these programs, they would take the package, they would sell them off, and then they would be on their way, right? And then they would think, okay, well, how do I actually make a living? And oftentimes, so I did a survey in 2008, looking at the livelihoods of former combatants, about 1,000 of them. And the vast majority of them were not doing what those packages were meant to do. They were doing what they knew before, which is farming, things like that, okay? Or maybe they would make a little kiosk, okay? So the reintegration packages were not working the way the narrative would say. The last part, and I think this is the most important one, GAM did not demobilize. They did not demobilize. Instead, what they did was they took the GAM organizational structure, kept it intact, and repurposed it by making it into an electoral political party, right? So Partai Aceh and KPA, right? And these two became a vehicle for them to then move into government, into local government. So this story of external actors playing the crucial role, I think, is only a part of the story. And what I want to talk about is what really sustained the peace, which I think is what was on the ground. So I look at three main factors here. The first is the local political parties. So as part of the MOU, I think the most decisive part was the fact that for for the first time, Aceh was allowed to run and organize local political parties that didn't have to have offices in every province, right? And what this did was it freed them of the dominance of Jakarta's elite, right? So you didn't have to have PDIP or Golkar or Partai Demokrat, right, as the parties of the different candidates. And instead, you could have Partai Aceh, a local party, or later on Partai Nasional Aceh, right? So local political parties provided local communities, including GAM, a vehicle with which to take part in the governance of the province, sort of separate from Jakarta-based politicians. The second factor is the presence of significant special autonomy funds, right? So if you're going to be able to win local office, like many of the GAM elite did, then you need to be able to govern with something and the funds to do so. So I think that was very important because it created incentives for former combatants to cooperate and continue to implement the peace. The third aspect is what I mentioned before, which is keeping GAM's organizational structure intact and repurposing it as a political party. And what this did was it gave GAM a voice, it gave GAM access to resources, but when you give people a bunch of resources, you say, here are these peace dividends. Well, dividends that are meant for peace. Oftentimes, peace dividends, though, create conflict, right? Because you put money in the middle of people, it's natural that they're going to compete. And that competition leads to conflict, it leads to resentment, and potentially violence. So this is where it's really, I think what we need to do is we need to understand how negotiations shift from pre-peace agreement to post-peace agreement. So during the negotiations over a peace agreement, you have effectively the insurgent elites and the government leaders, and they are negotiating against each other. And that is the axis, that's the key cleavage, okay? After you sign a peace agreement, the insurgent and government leaders are now partners. And so now they're on the same team, ironically, right? Even though they wanted each other dead at one point. But they've already signed, they've shaken their hands, now they're partners. So the key cleavage then actually turns to within the insurgent organization, between the insurgent leaders and the mid-level and rank-and-file fighters, right? Because now you have resources that have to be distributed within the insurgent organization. How do you decide that this mid-level commander gets funds whereas this one doesn't, right? If you give sort of rents to this commander or this faction, then other factions may dispute it, may get jealous, right? And so trying to understand how to keep them in line is really, I think, the fundamental aspect of post-conflict negotiations. So this is where we have to focus on mid-level commanders. Now, why are mid-level commanders so important? Well, if you look, and this is where we turn to the comparative literature, if you look at the moral movements of the southern Philippines, so very similar to GAM. 1970s, they both sort of declared that they wanted to have an independent state from the Philippine center, just like Aceh wanted to be independent of Indonesia. 1976, they had one initial peace agreement between the MNLF and the Philippine government, and then that led to the first splinter group, which is the Moral Islamic Liberation Front, the MILF. MILF splinters off. 1996, there was the final peace agreement between the MNLF and the government. More people from the MNLF splinter off into not only the MILF, but the Abu Sayyaf. And then 2008, there was another peace agreement between the MILF and the government. Then you started getting these other splinter groups. Eventually, they declare for ISIS. 2012, they finally come to this peace agreement that was more inclusive of the MILF factions, and there's less splintering in that case, okay? But the key point here is, how do you keep these mid-level commanders who are capable of creating a viable splinter group in line? That's really the story of Aceh. So Aceh was able to do this, and I think the key here is that they basically said, we are not going to demobilize. The organizational structure that we invested in over 30 years of fighting to keep discipline within our organization, we are not going to sort of break that up, because that is an asset for us. It was an asset for war making during the pre-MOU period. Now, maybe it's an asset for us in terms of winning office, but also keeping our former combatants in line. And so they kept the structure together, and that was very effective in keeping the splinter groups from breaking off. And we saw instances of this, right? Abu Minimi being one example. We even had different factions within GAM that became different political parties. 2012, as I mentioned earlier, there was this violence around the second gubernatorial elections. Later on, there wasn't that kind of violence, right? And so the idea is, if you are able to repurpose these structures to win political office, and then use it then to create incentives to continue to implement the peace process, but also discipline those who might splinter off, this is really, I think, the key. And so this is really the difference between, to my mind, the case of Aceh and the southern Philippines, where they weren't able to maintain the structure. And actually, when I've gone over to the southern Philippines, they always ask, what did they do in Aceh? How did Aceh succeed? And the thing that I always tell them is, they kept, first of all, they had local elections, but then they kept the GAM structure cohesive, and MILF should do the same. In fact, MILF has been doing the same thing. They've kept the structure. I think they've learned, and I know that there are some consultants from Aceh who have gone over there. I've sort of provided my inputs to them as well. But that's really what I think is explaining a lot of the success in this latest peace agreement over there. So I'll conclude with just saying that I think there are some broader lessons that, first of all, I think we can celebrate the successes so far of Aceh, but also really to sort of say that, it's important to see how these lessons could carry over to other contexts, like in the southern Philippines, like in southern Thailand, maybe in Myanmar, in different contexts. And the key being, it's important to ensure that insurgent elites are incorporated into the political process, to sort of think about how you can repurpose organizational structures of insurgent organizations for civilian purposes. And then really, I would even argue and make a call to the Indonesian government to think about how you can sort of exercise leadership in saying, hey, we have some experience now in Indonesia in some conflict zones like Maluku, in Poso, and also in Aceh. And what other contexts, especially in this region, can learn from us, rather than going over to Scandinavia or Switzerland or whatever to say, hey, we need your expertise. Actually, a lot of the expertise is here, and this is a very different model. Again, very different from the UN sort of DDR model that I think Indonesia deserves a lot of credit for. Thank you very much. I look forward to more conversation. Thank you.